My name's Ellen Melton. I'm in MUNM 3213 with Dr. Giacona, and I'm just going to be elaborating on my research paper over musical cultural appropriation and misappropriation in North America. So in doing this, I hope to convey and present a thesis that maintains that these ideals right here overall, they just contribute to an overall culture of misappropriation. And in turn, I hope to answer the question, does music unite or divide us? Throughout this course, we've seen that music has been just a sacred ritual. It's the cornerstone of a lot of native cultures, but also I think this is a really nuanced question, and I hope to convey that mainstream culture, mainstream pop music, especially in the United States, when used irresponsibly and when used carelessly, racist tendencies can permeate the culture, and music can be used as a weapon against indigenous cultures. And so I think it's really important that we define our terms. So I want to define racial antipathy, playing Indian, black minstrelsy, singing red face, cultural misappropriation, idealized sympathy, and cultural confusion. So we'll start with racial antipathy. And overall racial antipathy generally refers to not clumsy acts of, overgeneralizations. These are deliberate, cynical, sinister attacks on indigenous people or minorities in general. But here, obviously, we have an indigenous scope. And so it's the process of projecting a negative or untrue assumption onto a people group. And usually it's under the guise of colonialism or Orientalism, but here I think colonialist attitudes definitely permeate the scene. And so one of the most egregious and the most terrifying quotes that we've seen in Dr. Giacona's book was a quote from Philip Henry Sheridan: "The only good Indian is a dead Indian." And so we go back to the era in Oklahoma history, especially of these assimilation boarding schools, where one of the main tenets and components was kill the Indian, save the man. And so that's another one of the earliest examples of racial antipathy towards indigenous people. And so music, in a lot of ways, mainstream music, has contributed to racial antipathy. So one of the best examples, I think, of racial antipathy in modern music in the 1960s would be Your Squaws on the Warpath, and it's by Loretta Lynn. She kind of, exploded onto the music scene, the country music scene in the 1960s, and her song, Your Squaw on the Warpath, serves as one of, again, the most blatant examples of racial antipathy, and in doing so, she paints Native relationships in a negative light, and it's broadly just untrue. They're sort of unfounded stereotypes that really aren't based in any kind of fact. But yeah, no, that starting with the fact that it is using the term squaw. Squaw is a derogatory term. No one uses it, and it was created by the white man. So that is bad. So when we look at some of these lyrics, I just want to point out just a few. So, well, your pet name for me is Squaw. When you come home a drinking and can barely crawl, and all that lovin' on me won't make things right. Well, you leave me at home to keep the teepee clean, 6 papooses to break, and when wean, well, your squaw is on the warpath tonight. And so, starting at the beginning, again, just reiterating the term squaw, that is not used within indigenous culture. It's a derogatory term used by white people to discriminate against indigenous people. And then the next line, it gets into this broadly untrue and derogatory stereotype of Native American men that they have an alcohol problem, still to this day. That is something that a lot of Native American activists are trying to combat, this idea that Native American men are drunkards. And so then all that lovin' on me won't make things right. And then it goes into these just antiquated ideals of, Indian culture, teepees, six papooses. This was in the 60s. So like, again, what's wrong with this in general is the fact that these lyrics oversimplify and overgeneralize an entire people group. And then again, her costume right here, it's a sexualized version of like sacred regalia. Again, kind of assimilating them into something that like is consumable. So then next we have playing Indian. So this is like non-Indians usurping like sacred indigenous culture, customs, and regalia for clout or for performance. So then it's used in like sports and mainstream culture. So like sports teams known as like the Indians or the Redskins or the Seminoles, whatever. And then summer camps using indigenous tribes to create a competitive binary. That's another example. But then entertainment. We see it in Peter Pan when the Darling children come on and like they meet up with the Pickaninny tribe, which is already a racist trope. They're then able to become Indian, which is not something that you can do. So then next we need to get into Black minstrelsy. It's the precursor in many ways to what we know as blackface today, or like today's blackface and then like redface. And so in like the early 19th century, in like the 1820s, Americans had this newfound fascination with, you know, the Black American experience. And so these minstrel shows would have white men use blackface, and it was just like, it boomed. There was such a market for Black minstrel shows. And so like it came all the way up through like the Jim Crow era. And it ushered in an environment that encouraged this kind of satire, and then it encouraged it in Native populations also. So then, singing redface. Here I have some examples of like white people dressed as Indians. This is technically known as redface. And so there are implications and consequences. So it's oppressive, it's insensitive, and it's tokenizing. And redface, in the words of Dr. Giaccona, occurs when a non-Native person takes on the racial archetype of a Native American character through song. So then next is cultural misappropriation. And it's a direct product of racial antipathy, and this is the mode by which powerful demographics in society either purposefully or unpurposefully misrepresent a minority culture. And so misappropriation has many forms, and so you'll see it in regalia, performers in pop culture wearing headdresses, you know, making sexualized versions of traditional sacred regalia, and then mannerisms and characteristics, you know, mimicking vocables. And then Florida State, their football team, their fans will do like a tomahawk chop in the stadium. So then these last 2 points, idealized sympathy and cultural confusion. So on the top we see that idealized sympathy is tokenizing, overgeneralized, and inauthentic. It's tokenizing when like the oppressed really just feel more oppressed. It's overgeneralized when we overlook essential nuances, and then it's inauthentic when like these like stereotypes and overgeneralizations should be obsolete for like sympathy to be legitimate, but oftentimes it's not. So then cultural confusion is a product of actively false information, and it occurs when like a slew of incorrect accusations are thrown upon Native people. It's also a tool for assimilation, and it's stripping Native peoples of their authentic identity. That creates, you know, an oppressive system in which like the oppressor is able to create, you know, whatever identity they want for a minority group, and then this creates also low self-esteem. When you kind of feel this sort of imposter syndrome or just a poor self-image, when you don't really know where your heritage comes from. And so those are kind of overall the consequences of misappropriation in music. Thank you so much.